We're told Antarctica is the closest place on Earth to another world, a continent of ice, silence and secrets where even basic facts feel like they're filtered through someone else's hands. But every once in a while, something slips through the cracks. This story begins with one of those cracks. A moment when a routine scientific mission drifted into territory nobody was trained for. And the deeper we go, the stranger the records become. What makes this one different is how the clues never line up the way they're supposed to. You've got testimonies that vanish, evidence that shifts shape depending on who's talking about it, and officials who acted like they were racing against a truth they didn't want slipping through their fingers. You know how every place on Earth feels mapped, photographed, explored and explained? Antarctica ruins that illusion in a single glance. Before any drilling began, scientists already knew they were dealing with a continent that didn't behave like the rest of the planet. Beneath thousands of meters of ice, radar surveys were picking up valleys, ridges, and more than 100 hidden lakes sealed away from sunlight for millions of years. These lakes stretch for miles under the ice sheet, locked away in conditions so extreme that even the most hardened researchers struggled to compare them to anything else on Earth. When the first radar images came in, what they revealed didn't just surprise geologists, it unsettled them. Smooth patches under the ice suggested liquid water, where there should have been nothing but frozen ground. Some lakes showed warm spots, as if something beneath the ice was generating heat. And as the data came in, a pattern formed. These lakes were completely sealed off from the outside world. But the strangest part wasn't the lakes themselves. It was the life scientists suspected might exist down there. Isolation changes things. Creatures trapped for long enough evolve in directions that make no sense on the surface. In other parts of the world, deep caves, boiling vents, toxic springs and organisms have already been found that break the rules of biology. So what would a sealed Antarctic lake produce after being cut off for millions of years? Long before the drilling rigs and research stations arrived, early explorers were already whispering about Antarctica's odd behaviour. Back in the early 20th century, legends started forming from people who were not supposed to exaggerate. The explorers themselves. Men like Roald Amundsen and Richard Byrd kept notes that were never meant for public eyes. They wrote about hearing deep, distant sounds beneath the ice, groans, rumbles and rhythmic pulses that didn't match wind or ice movement. Some even reported shadows or mass displacement under the surface, as if something enormous was shifting far below their feet. These weren't conspiracy theorists. These were military-trained navigators trying to stay alive in a frozen desert. When Antarctica became a strategic piece of Cold War geography, these stories resurfaced in a very different way. The US and the Soviet Union were racing across the ice. Research stations popped up fast, part science outpost, part listening post, part geopolitical chess move. Antarctica turned into a strange combination of scientific curiosity and covert surveillance. Under the friendly handshake of international cooperation, each side watched the other closely. Every drilling effort, every radar scan, every seismic reading became another data point in a quiet intelligence war. In this tense environment, Lake Vostok stood out immediately. It was the largest, deepest, and the most isolated. Its roof was almost 4 kilometers of ice. Its pressure was 130 times higher than anything on the surface. And its water hadn't touched the outside world since before humans existed. If there was anywhere to find life that evolved differently from anything we know, this was the place. No sunlight, no heat from the surface, no food from the ecosystem above. Yet somehow temperatures and chemical readings suggested the lake was not dead. What made Vostok even more interesting were the early Soviet research papers that stayed classified for decades. When some of these documents quietly resurfaced years later, a few lines stood out. They spoke of potential complex biological structures in isolated subglacial environments. That wording didn't slip through by accident. Scientists are careful with language, especially Soviet scientists who wrote under strict oversight. So why use a word that implied multicellular organisms? That question became even harder to ignore when researchers found that Vostok wasn't just sealed, it was active. Seismic readings showed pulses in the lake, temperature maps showed warm anomalies, and the ice above it occasionally shifted in ways that didn't match weather patterns. Something was happening under that frozen cover. As the Soviets prepared for deep drilling, One suspicion kept coming up, quietly behind closed doors. Were they expecting simple single-celled life, or did they already suspect something bigger? That unanswered question became the unspoken engine behind the entire Vostok mission. And as we shift to how the station was built, that question only grows stronger. By the time the Soviets committed to building Vostok Station, they already knew it would be one of the hardest projects they'd ever attempted. The temperature alone pushed the limits of human endurance. Winter lows hit 80-degree highs. Machinery that worked fine elsewhere froze solid in minutes. Steel became brittle. Cables snapped like dry twigs. Even fuel turned slushy. And yet, the construction crews kept pushing because the lake beneath the ice was too valuable to ignore. The station was built in stages, each one more brutal than the last. Workers hammered supports into ice that groaned under every impact. They dragged equipment across miles of frozen terrain where the wind could tear metal sheets out of their hands. Every mistake meant frostbite, or worse. But somehow the structure rose. A tiny cluster of buildings sitting on one of the most dangerous remote points on the planet. Living there was survival carved into routine. The crew stayed for year-long stretches without sunlight. The winter darkness never lifted. People cracked under the pressure. Some slept with radios playing just to hear another human voice. Others carved marks on walls to track days when clocks felt useless. Inside this isolation, the key figures of the Vostok mission took shape. A.M. Yelagin, the expedition chief, held the team together with a calm authority. Alexis Vinogradov, the radio operator, kept them connected to the world, at least when the winds didn't drown the signal. Dr. Marta Kalashnik, a biologist with the discipline of a former athlete, became the voice of scientific reason when the conditions turned chaotic. And then there was Dr. Anton Padalka, the physicist who would later become a defector, a man who saw something at Vostok he could never forget. These people were researchers trapped in a place that stripped away everything unnecessary. They learned fast that Antarctica didn't care about their goals. The environment was the enemy. The first drilling attempts proved that immediately. Bits melted, cracked, or vaporized entirely. Shafts they dug froze overnight. Equipment collapsed under pressure no one fully understood. Every step forward came with setbacks that looked like sabotage from the ice itself. But as frustrating as the failures were, something else began creeping into the picture. Strange thermal readings around the drill site. Internal memos later revealed phrases like unexpected heat signatures and non-geological anomalies. Nothing was explained, nothing was clarified, but the scientists knew the data didn't match simple Earth processes. Still, they pushed on. A decade of slow drilling followed, filled with broken machinery, damaged supplies, and near-constant danger. Eventually, they built a custom one-man elevator designed to reach deeper layers, something so experimental that other countries questioned whether it was safe at all. That didn't matter. The Soviets simply locked the doors and kept outsiders away. 10 years of effort led to a single moment. As the drill neared the lake, pressure readings spiked sharply. Instruments shook. The ice vibrated in a way no one could explain. Something under the surface reacted to the approaching drill. And right when the readings became unstable, Soviet command did something unexpected. They ordered strict radio silence. Vinogradov, the radio operator, was told to shut everything down. No outgoing messages, no status updates, no warnings to the international teams listening nearby. Whatever was happening under Vostok was now classified. The crew felt the tension immediately. They didn't need explanations. The lake was reacting. The ice was moving, and the mission had crossed into territory no one had prepared for. Breaking into the lake. The final hours before the breakthrough didn't feel like the end of a mission. Everyone at Vostok Station kept glancing at the instruments, waiting for numbers that made sense, but the readings just grew stranger. Temperatures near the drill shaft rose a few degrees, then dropped, then rose again. That shouldn't have been possible. The ice was supposed to behave like a dead block, not react to anything. Yet the monitors pulsed with shifting heat signatures, as if the lake below was breathing in slow, heavy intervals. Biological sensors added another layer of confusion. They were designed to detect simple microbial life, tiny trace mixtures of organic molecules that show up as faint, predictable blips. Instead, the equipment began producing signals that didn't match any microbe profile. The patterns were larger, more irregular, almost shifting. The biologist, Dr. Marta Kalashnik, stared at the screen with her jaw set tight. No one wanted to jump to conclusions, but those readings looked like something with size, something with structure, and no one had the courage to suggest that out loud. Then the warning alarm started to blink. A sudden vibration ran through the metal platform. The drill bit had hit something softer. The temperature spiked again, sharper this time. And then, after millions of years sealed away, the drill finally punched through the ceiling of Lake Vostok. As protocol demanded, they lowered a specialized probe into the opening. The probe carried cameras, sonar, sampling lines, and a reinforced shell to handle the lake's monstrous pressure. Everything worked smoothly at first, but once it slipped fully into the water, the screen started showing distortions. The sonar displayed shifting blobs, as if something large was moving but too fast to capture clearly. At one point, a long shape appeared at the edge of the sonar arc, then vanished before the operator could lock onto it. The deeper the probe travelled, the more unstable the readings became. Shapes flickered across the screen, faint silhouettes and irregular motions, but nothing they could label. The divers, meanwhile, were already prepping for what would be the first descent into the lake. They had trained for years, but even they couldn't hide the tension. Day one of the dive arrived with a silent, heavy anticipation. Padalka double-checked every seal on his suit. Kalashnik tested the internal sensors twice. Even Vinogradov, the radio operator who wasn't part of the dive but monitored all communications, kept glancing at the lake entrance, like it held answers. When the divers slipped into the water, the first shock came instantly. The lake was unnaturally clear. Not just clean, clear in a way that made them feel exposed. Their lights cut through long tunnels of nothingness. Then the strangeness began. Translucent shapes drifted past their lights. They weren't fish and they weren't plants. Some were long, ribbon-like strands that moved with slow, pulsing motions. Others hovered in place like tiny, floating sacs. None of them behaved like typical aquatic life. Kalashnik whispered through the comms that she'd never seen anything form shapes like that. Deeper in the lake, a faint rhythmic pulse echoed through their sensors. Not sound, not vibration, more like a repeating pattern, moving through the water. Every diver heard it through their suits. Vinogradov, listening from the surface, reported something even stranger. He'd detected what he called a second heartbeat beneath the diver's own audio signals, something slow, heavy, and absolutely not mechanical. He tried tracing it, but the pattern shifted every time he locked onto it. Minutes later, the alarms in the dive bay lit up. Communications began dropping in and out. Static replaced parts of people's voices. Then full sections of the audio cut to silence. Padalka tried to restore the link, but the water scrambled the signals. Soon only fragments of words were making it back. Then came the final recorded message. Kalashnik's voice panicked, struggling broke through the static. "Something is moving, it's not alone." The channel cut off completely. Inside the station, Vinogradov stared at the blank screen, waiting for another signal. Nothing came. And for the team trapped in the lake, the real nightmare was only beginning. The divers pushed forward, trying to maintain formation. As their lights carved thin tunnels through the black water, the loss of communication rattled them, but training kept them moving. Every few seconds, someone flashed their suit beacon to signal they were still alive. The lake swallowed the light almost instantly. Then a large shape drifted past the edge of the beam. It barely looked like anything, just a smooth blur that curved gracefully around the darkness. Before anyone could respond, the creature came closer. It didn't rush or charge. It simply glided past them again, faster this time. Fast enough that their cameras only caught a hazy streak. That was the moment Vinogradov, monitoring the sonar from above, saw something terrifying. The unidentified mass on the screen was matching the divers' movements, slowing when they slowed, speeding up when they did. And then it struck. The attack didn't look like an attack. It started with Vinogradov himself, who had been lowered halfway into the lake to help relay signals after the comms blackout. One moment he was swimming beside the group, following their light arcs. The next, he stopped completely. He simply froze as if someone had pressed pause on him. The others turned to him in confusion. His face behind the visor twisted into a slow, dreamy smile, a peaceful expression that didn't match anything happening around them. Kalashnik tried calling his name, but he didn't react. His limbs loosened. His body floated upward, weightless and relaxed. Then something long and translucent shot out of the dark, wrapped around him, and dragged him into the blackness so fast the water snapped like a whip. Kalashnik screamed. Padalka pulled her backward before she could chase after him. Another diver flicked their emergency beacon, its bright pulse swallowed instantly. Panic hit them all at once. No one had ever seen movement like that underwater. Nothing moved with that level of precision or speed. They retreated toward the ascent point, trying to stay close. But even as they swam upward, the water around them shifted. Back at the station, the surviving divers stumbled into the decompression chamber, shaking and shouting over one another. The moment they removed their helmets, the questions hit at once. As soon as the footage was downloaded from their suit cameras, Padalka and Yeligin reviewed it frame by frame. Most of it was blurry, but then they found the moment just before the attack. A single clip that froze everyone who watched it. A massive, translucent shape, drifting through the beam, 30 to 40 feet long. Flexible, smooth, almost gelatinous. But the detail that stood out most wasn't the size, it was the arms. 14 long, whip-like appendages that moved independently in perfect coordination. Padalka grabbed a pen and sketch pad, his hand trembling slightly, and drew the first rough outline of what they'd seen. That sketch would later be known as the first depiction of Organism 46B, a creature with the silhouette of an octopus, but built for a world of darkness and crushing pressure. As they reviewed the footage again, Kalashnik noticed something else. There was no visible bite, no puncture marks. Vinogradov wasn't grabbed violently. He was paralyzed before the creature even touched him. That meant the toxin wasn't injected through physical contact. It was released into the water through an ink sac, a biological trap perfectly evolved for a predator that hunts in total darkness. The team demanded the mission be called off. Command, however, saw things differently. They weren't in Antarctica for safety, they were there for discovery. The more dangerous the organism became, the more valuable it was to capture. So the mission continued. The message arrived early the next morning. The command had reviewed the footage, the logs, the sonar, and the behavioral notes. Their conclusion was simple. Organism 46B was too important, too rare, and too advanced to risk letting it disappear back into the lake. They wanted it captured alive. So the trap began. The engineers spent hours designing a containment tank strong enough to restrain something that moved with brutal force. They used reinforced steel with cross-braced shielding, hydraulic clamps, a magnetic lock so powerful the generator needed a separate line. The tank itself looked like a submarine cut in half, thick, sealed and barely, large enough for the creature. Every bolt was tested, every joint checked multiple times. They had seen what 46B could do to metal. Nothing short of military-level construction would hold it. Then came the hardest part, choosing a lure. Kalashnik stepped forward before anyone else. She didn't do it out of bravery. She did it because she knew the creature responded most strongly to movement patterns, spacing, and signals. And she had spent more time analysing those patterns than anyone. If someone had to serve as bait, she wanted it to be her. The team hated the decision, but no one had a better alternative. They prepared her suit with additional armour plating and a built-in emergency blade. She selected an ice axe for close defence, blunt enough to push, sharp enough to cut. As the others positioned the containment tank underwater, Kalashnik descended alone. The creature lunged at Kalashnik again, but the magnetic locks pulled its limbs inward. The tank sealed shut with a deafening metallic slam. For a moment, everything seemed still. Then the thrashing began. The creature smashed itself against the walls of the tank so violently, the steel shuddered. The lights flickered. One of the clamps bent nearly out of position. The team scrambled to reinforce it, as the thing inside twisted and slammed its body with unnatural strength. It finally slowed after nearly 2 minutes, its movements becoming calmer, almost calculated. And in that strange quiet, it floated near the viewing panel and stared directly at Padalka. They hauled the tank toward the elevator shaft, each person keeping a hand on the metal to feel for vibrations. The echoes grew softer as they ascended. Then slowly the sound stopped completely. No movement. Within minutes the creature was gone. The station was left with nothing but a cold, empty shaft. and the echo of something that had stared at them like it already knew what would happen next. The moment the tank broke the surface, the temperature inside Vostok station seemed to drop even lower. Not because of the cold, but because everyone in the room realized control had shifted. Armed personnel marched in like they'd been waiting for this exact second. No greetings, no questions, no curiosity. Just soldiers doing a job they'd rehearsed long before the scientists even arrived in Antarctica. The team barely had time to step back before the commanding officer barked a simple order. The expedition found nothing. No creature, no samples, no discovery. Just ice and water. Anyone who dared correct that version of events would be signing their own prison sentence. The scientists didn't argue. No one wanted to be the one who tested how serious that threat really was. Then came the chemicals. Drums were hauled toward the shaft, sealed barrels with faded hazard labels, and numbers scratched off. It didn't matter what was inside. What mattered was the intention. The liquid hissed as it poured down into the opening that had taken a decade to drill. Whatever connection existed between the surface and the lake vanished under a cloud of fumes and a thick chemical seal. The message was clear. This place would never be opened again. Not by this team. Not by anyone. Within an hour, the station felt stripped bare. Notebook, sketches, camera tapes, samples, vials, sonar logs. All gone. Soldiers moved through every corridor, pulling drawers open, emptying pockets, ripping cables from the walls. Anything that even hinted at the truth disappeared into crates that no team member was allowed to inspect. Even personal journals weren't spared. The silence in the room felt heavier than the ice above them. When the official press release finally came, it was almost insulting. After years of drilling and risking their lives, the world was told that the results were inconclusive. The message painted Lake Vostok as an unremarkable bubble of ancient water. Anyone who wanted more answers was encouraged to wait for future expeditions. But the team knew there would be no future expeditions. Not after what they saw being hauled away in that steel tank. Then came the NDAs. These were signed under the shadow of rifles and the threat of entire families being blacklisted. The team was forced to swear that nothing unusual had happened. Anyone who cracked would be charged with treason. And in the Soviet Union, that word swallowed your entire life. But inside the station's remaining files, documents the soldiers thought were unimportant, Padalka found internal memos. The first objective was to study the venom, a toxin that left victims calm, emotionless, and motionless within seconds was seen as a perfect tool. The second objective was even darker. Research the mimicry. If a creature could imitate a diver's shape well enough to fool a trained scientist in cold, black water, what could that ability do in espionage? Padalka finally saw the truth. This mission was never meant to be about understanding the lake. It wasn't about biology or evolution or extremophiles. It was a military program from the start. The scientists were just tools, paid with isolation, stress, and danger, while the real beneficiaries waited safely in Moscow. That realization broke something in him. The others tried to move on with their lives, but Padalka couldn't drop the weight of what he'd seen. The last look that creature gave him kept spinning in his mind, not because it was frightening, but because it seemed to understand. Years later, when the Soviet Union collapsed, he slipped out of the country on a train ride with a forged passport and a bag stuffed with documents he stole from the station's archives. Documents he knew could get him killed, but they were the only proof he had left. He resurfaced in Switzerland with sunken eyes, shaking hands, and a story that no scientist, journalist, or intelligence officer was prepared to hear. When Padalka first appeared in Europe, he looked like someone who had spent years trying and failing to outrun something. His hair had gone grey too early, his fingers trembled even when he held a cup of tea, and he had this habit of flinching whenever someone entered a room too quietly. It wasn't paranoia, it was memory. The kind of memory that never let him sleep without a light on. His breakdown didn't happen all at once. It came slowly. First, he tried to pretend nothing had happened. He took academic jobs under false names, but they never lasted long. Colleagues noticed the blank stares, the sudden shaking fits, the nights where he'd snap awake because something in his dream had grabbed him again. Eventually he started talking, but not to the world. He picked a small group of European journalists, people who had covered Soviet intelligence leaks before. At first he kept things vague. The journalists thought he was exaggerating, maybe even unstable. But then he showed them drawings, pages and pages of sketches, each one more detailed than the last. Translucent limbs, web-like membranes, a head structure that didn't match any known cephalopod. And in every drawing there was a sense of intelligence behind the shape. Then he opened his notebooks, behavior logs, patterns of movement, notes on how it reacted when approached from different angles. He described how organism 46b learned faster than anything he'd ever encountered. It didn't just adapt, it observed. According to Padalka, the creature understood team formations. It recognized which divers carried weapons. And after the first trap failed, it never approached the team the same way again. Each encounter became more deliberate, more calculated, more like it was studying the humans as much as they were studying it. Then came the claim that forced journalists to take him seriously. He said the creature had been moved to a classified facility in remote parts of Siberia. Locations known for being tied to experimental programs. Places where people were transferred quietly and never mentioned again. One journalist asked how the Russians had kept the thing alive. The venom. It paralyzed prey without killing them. If the creature fed rarely, the facility wouldn't need to provide much. The question that followed was worse. Did the creature reproduce? Offspring likely remain under Vostok, he said. The lake was never empty. We only met one. After that, he shared something that stuck with the journalist for months. The toxin. He explained how it worked, how it entered the body, how it shut down muscle control while keeping the brain fully aware. Then he revealed the line that broke the last doubt anyone had about him. He said the lake wasn't just a body of water, it was a biosphere, a world inside a world. And organism 46b was an apex predator, adapted to complete darkness, high pressure, and total isolation. The moment Padalka's testimony spread through scientific circles, something shifted. Researchers who had stayed quiet for years finally stepped forward, saying privately that the original Vostok expedition had always felt incomplete. They wanted answers, and for the first time, their demands were loud enough that governments couldn't ignore them. Teams from France, Japan, the US, and even smaller research nations began pushing for joint access to Lake Vostok. They argued that if something truly lived under that ice, the discovery belonged to the entire world, not just one country guarding it like a vault. Russia responded the way Russia always does when backed into a corner. It tightened its grip. Instead of agreeing to international oversight, officials sealed off the entire region around Vostok Station. They blamed environmental protocols, saying the lake was too delicate and too ancient to risk contamination. The timing was convenient. The restrictions went into effect exactly when foreign scientists asked for entry. Anyone looking at the bigger picture knew this wasn't about protecting nature. It was about protecting secrets. But ice doesn't hide everything. As the world pressed for answers, satellites captured strange anomalies over the region. The first reports showed heat signatures beneath the ice cap. This shouldn't have happened. Vostok was supposed to be sealed off from geothermal warmth, yet something was producing heat, and not a small amount. Days later, additional scans revealed movement inside the ice sheet itself. Then came the plumes. For a few hours on a cold January morning, a thin tower of vapor rose from a crack several kilometers from the sealed drill site. Cameras caught it. News outlets ran it. Russia denied it. But the footage was real, and once it reached NASA, everything got stranger. NASA stepped in publicly, expressing interest in studying extremophiles in Lake Vostok. They didn't mention organism 46b. They didn't mention Padalka. They focused on Europa. Their argument was simple. If something could survive in Vostok's darkness, it might be similar to whatever lived beneath Europa's icy crust. Behind the scenes, the politics turned darker. Intelligence leaks claimed Russia had begun studying the venom from 46b for covert operations. Not in labs near Vostok, but in classified facilities deep inside Siberia. The toxin's ability to freeze muscle control without killing the brain made it a perfect weapon. Whistleblowers warned that the research wasn't defensive. It had applications. Then rumours doubled the fear. Reports said Russia didn't just capture one organism, they captured another in 2019. According to the whispers, the second organism was larger. While politicians argued and scientists drafted open letters, divers stationed near Antarctic supply points began reporting something new. At first, they brushed it off as stress or exhaustion, but eventually too many people experienced the same thing for it to be ignored. They heard metal scraping from beneath freshly frozen ice cracks, the sound of something using the underside of the ice, the way a person uses a wall to steady themselves. The reports spread fast among crews who had spent their lives working in polar environments, and these were people who didn't scare easily. Inuit communities stationed at joint research outposts near the coast reported sightings during blizzards. They described tall, pale figures moving across snowfields. Governments pretended to stay calm, but budgets don't lie. Defense agencies across several countries quietly increased funding for polar surveillance. New sensors were installed, more patrols were deployed, satellite programs got fast-tracked. Someone, somewhere, believed the threat was real enough to warrant millions in new spending. Through all this, Russia held its position. They simply pointed back to their environmental protocols and insisted the lake must remain untouched. But the world had reached its limit. Scientists across every major research nation signed a joint declaration demanding full disclosure from Russia. Not next year, not eventually, now. They wanted entry to the lake, they wanted to see the sealed labs, and they wanted answers about what really lived under that ice. To make sense of organism 46b, scientists had to start with what they knew about cephalopods. And even on the surface, cephalopods are strange. Octopuses solve problems. They open jars, they escape aquariums, they use tools. Their brains aren't centralized like ours, they're distributed across their limbs. Each arm can analyze information on its own. That alone makes them one of the smartest life forms on the planet. Now take that intelligence and place it in a pitch-black environment sealed away for millions of years. Instead of sunlight, there's pressure. Instead of predators, there's silence. Instead of options, there's only instinct and adaptation. Vostok could push evolution in directions we've never studied. One theory suggests that in this darkness, transparency became the default. Without light, camouflage through colors is useless. But becoming see-through, that's the ultimate defense. Deep-sea species already do this. Glass octopuses, comb jellies, and certain squids can almost vanish. Under Vostok's conditions, that adaptation would be extreme. Then there's the venom. Cephalopods on the surface expel ink. They use it to distract predators and disappear. But in a world without light, ink would be pointless. So the adaptation had to change. Instead of ink, evolution may have transformed that sac into a venom reservoir, a neurotoxin that spreads silently, without warning. Leaked samples, tiny traces smuggled out and tested anonymously, show amino acids not found in surface cephalopods. This doesn't mean extraterrestrial origin, it means isolation, millions of years of it. The real shock comes when looking at nerve distribution. A creature with 14 limbs thinks differently. Each limb might have its own neural cluster. Decisions could be instantaneous. Reaction times beyond anything humans can track. If one limb gets injured, the rest keep working. If one limb is severed, regeneration begins immediately. Some leaked documents mention regrowth within hours. That level of healing is unheard of in any known cephalopod. Mimicry might be the strangest adaptation of all. Surface octopuses mimic other animals because predators are predictable. But in Lake Vostok, there isn't a variety of life, so the creature had to improvise. According to Padalka's notes, it mimicked the only moving forms it ever encountered. Its own limbs, distorted reflections, and eventually, human divers. Then came the sonar readings, undisclosed at first, leaked later. The original expedition believed they encountered one creature, but sonar logs showed 3 distinct organisms in the deeper layers of the lake, each larger than the one caught. They stayed far from the drill site. Maybe they were cautious, maybe they were territorial, maybe they were simply waiting. Biologists who studied the leaked data noticed something else. The creature didn't attack out of fear. It approached divers first, like it wanted to observe before deciding what to do. That pattern matches certain social predators, creatures that study their environment before acting. By the time investigators thought they finally understood what happened, a whole new layer started rising from the shadows. Fresh claims, new voices, and people who insisted that the real truth wasn't buried in any official report, it was buried inside them. One of the first problems investigators faced was the people who kept coming forward with stories they swore were real, only to disappear again. Not because anyone forced them to, but because they were scared of how their lives changed the moment they started talking. There was the guide who claimed he saw lights in the sky on the night everything went wrong, but refused to give a second interview after strangers began showing up at his work. There was the woman who said she heard a metallic scream in the mountains days before search teams arrived, then shut down entirely after her neighbours told her she was inviting trouble. These are the kinds of details that don't fit into clean case files, but they stick because they feel raw, nervous, and absolutely out of place. That same nervous energy followed the investigators too. One of them talked about finding footprints that didn't match the group's clothing, stride, or weight. But when he tried to add it to the official notes, he was told to focus on the details that mattered. He didn't push back. But that hesitation is the kind that sits at the back of your mind for years. And that's exactly what it did. He carried it until retirement, then admitted it casually in an interview like it was no big deal. Except it is a big deal. Because small details ignored early on have a habit of exploding into something much larger later. And that's exactly what started happening. All these small, uncomfortable details began stacking into a shape no one could ignore. It didn't create a clean picture, but it definitely created movement. A search pilot swore he flew over the area twice before the bodies were found and saw no signs of the tent. A radio operator claimed he intercepted a message he wasn't supposed to hear, and a mountain worker insisted he watched military trucks heading into an area that was supposedly locked down for civilian safety. None of these stories were enough to solve anything, but every single one made the ground under the official narrative just a little softer. But the real turning point came from the people who never wanted to be involved at all. A young climber who stumbled onto part of the group's gear weeks before it was logged. A rescue worker who handled the clothing and later said it didn't behave like normal fabric. A photographer who captured images of search operations that were mysteriously missing when he returned to develop them. The more these people talked, the clearer it became that the mountain wasn't just a place where something went wrong, it was a place where stories were fighting each other for control. Up until now, everything has felt scattered. Different people, different claims, and different angles. But in this section, you start noticing something that feels a lot more intentional. Patterns. And the first pattern that stands out is the timeline, specifically how fast certain parts of it were sealed off or rewritten. The moment the bodies were found, a handful of officials suddenly appeared, who weren't part of any local authority. They weren't part of the rescue team either. They arrived, issued instructions, and then vanished with notes and reports that no one ever saw again. One rescuer said it felt like someone higher up already knew what they wanted the final story to be. But the strangest pattern wasn't in what the officials said, it was in what the search teams weren't allowed to say. These were people who had spent their entire lives in brutal mountain environments. They knew snow behavior, wind patterns, terrain pressure, avalanche signatures, you name it. Yet when some of them said the injuries didn't make sense, they were told to let the experts decide. When they said the footprints indicated calm movement, not panic, they were told it was not relevant. Then there was the equipment, the radiation levels, the missing photographs, the pages torn from journals. Every time someone tried to bring these up, a new distraction appeared, some fresh angle that pulled attention just far enough away. It didn't erase anything completely, but it diluted it just enough that no single thread felt strong enough to hold on to. And that's what made researchers years later so frustrated. They weren't fighting the mystery itself, they were fighting the absence of clean information. Files that should have been boring and procedural had strange edits. But here's where the pattern becomes undeniable. Every piece of information that suggested a natural cause was celebrated and spread. Every piece that pointed to something unnatural, whether human-made, military, or something environmental, was slowed down, questioned, or buried under lack of evidence. That imbalance is what tells you where the real energy was. People don't fight neutral information, they fight dangerous information, and that leaves you with the most uncomfortable part of all. Maybe the reason this story still survives isn't because nobody knows the truth, but because too many people know different pieces of it and none of them connect cleanly anymore. A broken puzzle doesn't stop being real, it just stops being solvable.